Dallas. So, let's talk about virtual assessment and more. And we really are going to be talking about assessment today and the whole cycle of assessment and planning and instruction and assessment and stuff. And I want to give credit for this metaphor that I'm using today to Dr. Robin Jackson. If you don't know Robin Jackson's work, and if you haven't read her book, Never Work Harder Than Your Students, you should read that book. And if you're a podcast person, you might want to listen to her podcast. It's mostly aimed at principals and people like that, but it's got some great stuff for teachers too. And one of the things in a recent episode that I heard that just absolutely changed my life was this metaphor of renters and owners of the learning, renters and owners of the process, renters and owners of the assessment work that we do. And if you think about it, Dr. Jackson's point, aiming at principals, was to make sure that teachers and students and other significant people in the life of the school have an ownership in the vision and in the stuff. Because her point was, we all know how differently you treat a piece of property or even just like a car if you rent it versus if you own it. And I got to thinking about it and I thought, it's kind of complicated too because sometimes you need to rent and sometimes it's better to own. So there are definitely some advantages to renting, to not really being an owner of the process. You don't have to maintain it, right? You just show up and you move in and you get it cleaned when you leave to try to get your deposit back. And we probably all have some stories about that, but you don't have to maintain it. You can just move in and move out within the terms of your lease. And if there's a problem, you don't have to worry about fixing it. You just call the landlord and they either fix it or send somebody to fix it, or sometimes they don't fix it, right? But there are some advantages to being a renter, both in the world and in this metaphor, to being a renter of the learning. But there's some disadvantages too. You really can't add value to the thing. As a renter of the learning process, you're just kind of there. You're just kind of participating in what somebody else is doing. You can't put your own spin on it. You can't really make it your own. You don't have any long-term security. And that landlord could evict you. They could not renew the lease, or they could just, there are various reasons why you can get evicted before the lease is over. So that applies to real estate, but it also applies to the learning process and the assessment process. So if you're getting this kind of a feeling from the work that you guys are doing in your classes, think about, is it that my students, and maybe even I, am kind of in the renter role? So what about owning, though? There are some definitely advantages to owning real estate, and there's some advantages to owning the learning process too. I mean, you do own it, or at least you co-own it, right? I mean, most people don't own their house outright. Most people take out a mortgage, so they and the bank own it. Even if you pay off your mortgage, you will still discover that you still have to pay your property taxes and other things, or you might not own it anymore. But you have an ownership stake. You have a real part of this process, even if it isn't like totally yours for all time. You can adapt and remodel the thing that you own. You can make it work for you. And, theoretically at least, you build value over time. And those are advantages of owning property, but they're also advantages of having an ownership share in the learning and in the assessment process and in everything else. The more investment in that process, the more of a sense of value and the more buy-in, right? That's a term that we use, that everybody has. So if you're thinking, how do I go about developing more of a sense of ownership on the part of my students? That's a really good question to ask. But, of course, there are disadvantages of being an owner too. When it breaks, you fix. I remember as a very early first house that we owned and something went wrong, and I realized, oh, when we call the plumber, we're going to have to pay the plumber. There is no landlord that I can call. I'm either going to have to fix it myself or I'm going to have to call somebody. It's harder to move. It's harder to move physically because you got to sell the house. It's harder to just move on when you have a big ownership in the learning process. And of course, it's not totally yours. There's still, metaphorically speaking, the bank and the property tax office. There's still other people involved with the learning process, but only you can decide in the end what's the right balance of owning and renting for your students and your situation. But if you're watching this, it's probably more the case that what you really want is something like this. You want a wonderful playground for you and your students to be. You want a happy group of people coming together around a common purpose and doing wonderful things and just loving the work that they do. And then it really doesn't matter whether that playground is rented or owned or just used. So, how do we get a little bit closer to that feeling? How do we do that this week? Of course, you can join us in the Let's Build a Thing Together group, and we're actually going to be aiming for that. Come join us in that when you're ready. But no matter what you do, remember it doesn't have to be difficult. It does not have to be complicated. And it does not have to be that hard as long as you don't try to do it all alone. The little boy in the swing cannot get that high by himself. Somebody had to push him on that swing. And we all need that person to help push us on our swing too. So until we see each other the next time, Walete Sodales.